Hello, this is Brian, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the March 3rd issue of the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Israel steps up airstrikes into Iran as Iran widens its response across the region. Israel stepped up airstrikes on Iranian missile launchers and factories Tuesday as Iran retaliated against Israel and across the Gulf region, disrupting energy supplies and travel. As explosions rang out in Tehran and in Lebanon, where Israel said it struck back at Hezbollah militants, the American embassy in Saudi Arabia came under a drone attack. 4 days into a war that President Donald Trump suggested would last several weeks, but perhaps longer, hundreds of people have been killed in Iran, including some Trump said he had considered as possible future leaders of the country. Iran has fired dozens of ballistic missiles at Israel, setting off air raid sirens across the country. The pace of the attacks appeared to be slowing, and Israel has intercepted most of the incoming fire, but some missiles have landed, killing 11 people. The spiraling nature of the war raised questions about when and how it would end. Trump seemed to leave open the possibility for more extensive U.S. military involvement, telling the New York Post on Monday that he was not ruling out the possibility of boots on the ground. The administration has given various objectives. While the initial U.S.-Israeli strikes killed Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and Trump urged Iranians to overthrow their government, senior administration officials have since said regime change was not the goal. Trump said Monday the military's campaign's 4 objectives were to destroy Iran's missile capabilities, wipe out its navy, prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon, and ensure that it cannot continue to support allied armed groups. Trump says people the U.S. had in mind to lead Iran are dead. Trump said Tuesday that someone from within the Iranian regime might be the best choice to take power once the U.S.-Israel campaign is finished. Speaking from the Oval Office Tuesday, Trump said Reza Pahlavi, the exiled son of Iran's toppled Shah, is not someone that his administration has considered in depth to take over. As far as possible leaders inside Iran, the people we had in mind are dead, Trump said. I guess the worst case would be do this and then somebody takes over who's as bad as the previous person, right? That could happen, Trump said. We don't want that to happen. Iran's leaders are scrambling to replace Khamenei, who ruled the country for 37 years. It's only the second time since the 1979 Islamic Revolution that a new supreme leader is being chosen. Potential candidates range from hardliners committed to confrontation with the West to reformists who seek diplomatic engagement. Israel and U.S. strike nuclear facilities and other targets in Iran. Information coming out of Iran has been limited because of poor communications, round-the-clock airstrikes, and tight restrictions on journalists. But across Iran's capital, aircraft were heard overhead and explosions rang out. The Israeli military said it conducted a wave of airstrikes on sites that produce and store ballistic missiles in Tehran and Isfahan. The United Nations nuclear watchdog said Iran's Natanz nuclear enrichment site had sustained some recent damage, though there was no radiological consequence expected. The U.S. hit Natanz during the 12-day war in June, when Israeli and American strikes greatly weakened Iran's nuclear program. Without offering evidence, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu claimed Iran was rebuilding new sites, new places underground for making atomic bombs. Iran has said it has not enriched uranium since June, though it has maintained its right to and says its nuclear program is peaceful. After Hezbollah fired missiles at Israel on Monday, Israel retaliated. On Tuesday, the Israeli military hit Beirut with more airstrikes and said it had moved additional troops into southern Lebanon. Fears rise in Tehran as bombardment of capital intensifies. New rounds of U.S. and Israeli airstrikes rattled Tehran and several other Iranian cities. Since midnight, I and my wife are hearing sound of explosions, said Ali Amoli, an engineer living in North Tehran, sometimes from the west side of the city and sometimes from other directions. Streets and gas stations appeared quieter than in recent days. Local media published images of a damaged commercial plane at Bushehr Airport that broke apart following an airstrike on Tuesday. A North Tehran resident who spoke on condition of anonymity for fear of retaliation described growing fears in the capital as it comes under heavy bombardment. The resident said most stores in the normally bustling area of Tashrish were closed and that ATMs were mostly out of cash. Bakeries and supermarkets were open, though, the resident said. Iran hits the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh and Washington pulls out staff. An attack from two drones on the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh caused a limited fire, according to Saudi Arabia's defense ministry, and the embassy urged Americans to avoid the compound. It followed an attack on the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait. U.S. embassies in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Lebanon said they were closed to the public. The U.S. State Department ordered the evacuation of non-emergency personnel and family in Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, Qatar, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates. In addition, the U.S. has urged citizens to leave more than a dozen Middle Eastern countries, though with much of the airspace closed, many remained stranded. The State Department said Tuesday it's preparing military and charter flights for Americans who want to leave the Middle East. Several other countries arranged evacuation flights for their citizens. The U.S.-Israeli strikes have killed at least 787 people in Iran, according to the Red Crescent Society. In Lebanon, where Israel launched retaliatory strikes on the Iranian-supported militant group Hezbollah, 40 people were killed, including 7 children, in Lebanon, the health ministry said. The ministry had previously said 52 people were killed. The U.S. military has confirmed 6 deaths of American service members. In addition, 3 people were killed in the United Arab Emirates, and 1 each in Kuwait and Bahrain. The conflict is roiling business interests in the Mideast. Iran has hit many countries deemed safe havens in the Mideast in retaliation for the U.S.-Israeli strikes. Recent targets included 2 Amazon data centers in the United Arab Emirates and 1 in Bahrain. Iran has also struck energy facilities in Qatar and Saudi Arabia and attacked several ships in the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow mouth of the Persian Gulf, through which a fifth of all oil traded passes, sending global oil and natural gas prices soaring. The Strait of Hormuz is closed, declared Iranian Brigadier General Ibrahim Jabari, an advisor to the paramilitary Revolutionary Guard, vowing that any ships that passed through it would be set on fire. Stock markets tumble, oil prices spike as U.S.-Israel war in Iran spreads across Mideast. Oil prices continue to rise while stock markets fall Tuesday as the war sparked by the U.S. and Israel spreads across the Middle East. By 1 p.m., West Texas Intermediate had risen $4.45 to $75.70 U.S. per barrel, an increase of just over 6%. That was down off its morning peak of $77.69. Brent C crude was up $4.75 to $82.49, also an increase of just over 6% after having risen as high as $84.96 earlier in the day. By 1 p.m., the TSX Composite Index plunged 2.35% to 33,733 points, wiping out $128 billion in stock value. In New York, the S&P 500 was down 1.3% to 6,789 points, erasing $817 billion in value. Airline shares around the world were also down, with many commercial flights in the Mideast being canceled because of the war. In the U.S., shares of both United Airlines and American Airlines were down by more than 2%. In Toronto, Air Canada shares were off by more than 1%. With Iran continuing to threaten oil shipments through the key Strait of Hormuz, as well as its attacks on countries across the Middle East which host a U.S. military presence, some analysts predict the price of crude oil could rise as high as $100 per barrel. WTI prices could rise toward $80 to $100 per BBL, potentially exceeding $100 temporarily if disruptions are prolonged, TD economist Mark Ercolau wrote in a research report. With roughly 20% of the global oil supply and 30% of the world's liquefied natural gas normally being shipped through the Strait of Hormuz, alternative routes can handle only part of the volume and for a relatively short time, Ercolau noted. While alternative pipelines in Saudi Arabia and the UAE could redirect an estimated 5 million barrels per day, these routes are insufficient to fully offset a prolonged disruption, Ercolau wrote. Even a short-lived closure would likely result in prices ratcheting higher with each day of interruption, while insurance and freight premiums could keep prices elevated even after physical flows resume. For each $1 US rise in the price of crude, there's roughly a 1 cent Canadian rise in the price of gasoline at the pumps, veteran oil industry economist James L. Williams, president of WTRG Economics, told the Star earlier this week. Israel stepped up airstrikes against Iranian missile launchers and factories Tuesday, and Iran retaliated across the Gulf region, disrupting energy supplies and travel. As explosions rang out in Tehran and in Lebanon, where Israel said it struck Hezbollah militants, the American embassy in Saudi Arabia came under drone attack. In a post on X, a regional security analyst said it's clear Iran is motivated to attack any oil or liquid natural gas moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Regional energy infrastructure is now a priority target for Iran, wrote Martin Kelly, head of the advisory group at EOS Risk. Following Iran's comments, not a single drop of oil will leave the Gulf. We must consider that all Gulf region energy, oil, and port infrastructure is at high risk of Iranian and possibly proxy attack. A report in FreightWaves, a shipping news website, said at least 6 ships carrying oil or gas have been hit by Iranian strikes since Saturday, and that several global container companies have stopped all cargo bookings in the Middle East. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Trump threatens to cut off trade after Spain denies use of airbase. U.S. President Donald Trump directed Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to cut off all trade with Spain after the country denied access to its military bases for his bombing campaign against Iran. I told Scott to cut off all dealings with Spain, Trump said Tuesday, during a meeting with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz at the White House. Trump did not explain how he planned to follow through with that threat, which could prove particularly difficult since the U.S. has a trading relationship with the broader European Union. Later, he suggested he had the power to impose a full embargo on goods from the country, though did not indicate explicitly that he planned to do so. Spain has absolutely nothing that we need other than great people, Trump said. They have great people, but they don't have great leadership. Trump has repeatedly expressed frustration with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez for rebuffing his call on NATO allies to raise defense spending to 5% of gross domestic product. Last October, the U.S. president said that Spanish should receive a trade punishment over the disagreement. I could tomorrow stop, or today, even better, stop everything having to do with Spain, all business having to do with Spain, have the right to stop it, embargoes, do anything I want with it, Trump continued. And we may do that with Spain. Dissent in the meeting affirmed his belief Trump had the legal ability to embargo Spanish goods without saying if he would pursue that path. Trump also criticized the UK for blocking him from using a military base on the island of Diego Garcia to carry out strikes on Iran, saying he was surprised while stopping short of making a similar trade threat. This is not the age of Churchill. I will say the UK has been very, very uncooperative with that stupid island that they have, Trump said. Sanchez has condemned U.S. and Israeli operations against Iran, saying that the effort would create a more uncertain international order. His government denied the use of bases in Rota and Moron for the strikes. Trump, earlier in the meeting, had expressed optimism that some very big trade deals he planned to discuss with Merz would work out. Iran war taxes U.S. diplomatic work and leaves Americans in the Mideast in limbo. The largest U.S. diplomatic drawdown in the Middle East since the Iraq War began more than 2 decades ago is creating an apparently unplanned-for crisis for the Trump administration as the United States and Israel strike Iran in a widening conflict. The State Department has been forced to close several embassies to the public, shut down at least one consulate, order the departure of embassy staff and families from at least 6 nations, and advise Americans in 14 countries to leave the region immediately, despite the war closing major airports and causing widespread flight cancellations. Nonetheless, the department said Tuesday that more than 9,000 Americans had safely returned from the Middle East since the weekend, many of them without government assistance, and that it was reaching out to those who have sought help. The State Department was securing military aircraft and charter flights for American citizens who wished to leave the Middle East, Dylan Johnson, Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, said Tuesday on X. He added that the department has been in contact with nearly 3,000 Americans wanting to leave the region or seeking information about how to depart. Charter flights were being arranged from Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. In countries where airports or airspace was closed, the department said, it is organizing land travel to countries where flights are available, including Egypt and Oman. Still, emergency reductions in embassy staffing and post-closure since the strikes in Iran began on the weekend have put a severe strain on the ability to help U.S. citizens in need of assistance that might usually be considered routine. Consular services are unavailable in many places, and the personnel reductions have limited crucial official engagements with allied and partner governments during the war, including in Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Pakistan, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. Biggest U.S. drawdown in region since Iraq War. The scale of the American drawdown in the region rivals, if not exceeds, what was done in the run-up to and the immediate aftermath of the Iraq invasion in 2003. Back then, the State Department reduced its staffing in more than a dozen countries and advised U.S. citizens to leave or seriously consider leaving countries throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia from Morocco to Pakistan. On Monday, Americans were told in a hastily drafted announcement posted on X to leave Bahrain, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen, even though commercial flights and other transportation have been disrupted. Americans had been advised early Tuesday that the State Department had ordered non-essential diplomats and embassy families to leave Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE. The embassies in Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia also were closed to the public Tuesday. But only one diplomatic mission, the U.S. consulate in Karachi, Pakistan, had completely suspended operations. A drone attack on the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh caused a limited fire, Saudi Arabia's defense ministry said. The strike in Riyadh caused part of the embassy's roof to collapse, although there were no reported deaths or injuries to staff, according to an internal State Department memo. It said there were no deaths or injuries after 2 drones hit the vicinity of the embassy in Kuwait City. Confusion leads to questions about preparations. Confusion was playing out around the region, raising questions about the preparations for possible military action and its impact on travel and the safety of Americans overseas, which is the State Department's primary responsibility. If Americans are being instructed to leave but are given no viable pathway, that suggests one of 2 things. The system is not being activated, or the system has atrophied, said Sean Vandiver, president of Afghan EVAC, a group that supports Afghan nationals seeking to come to the United States after having served with U.S. forces in Afghanistan. He noted that during the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, the Biden administration had organized the evacuation of 121,000 people in a matter of days. Crisis response cannot be partisan, he said. It has to survive transitions. It has to be staffed, exercised, and protected. The oversight question is straightforward. Was the post-Afghanistan crisis response architecture sustained, or has it been weakened? The State Department did not immediately respond to a query about its planning for embassy and consulate staffing or providing assistance to American citizens in the event of a conflict with Iran. The U.S. government cannot compel American citizens to leave any country. In rare circumstances, it can make it illegal for U.S. passports to be used for travel to a specific destination. The only such restriction is on North Korea, but before the strikes began, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Friday that the restriction might also be applied to Iran. Travel advice from the State Department, including admonitions not to visit a country or to leave it, often is not respected. Many people reside in or have close family living there and either ignore or decline to heed the advice. There are large numbers of U.S. citizens living in or traveling throughout the Middle East. The State Department, however, refuses to offer an estimate because Americans are not required to report their presence in any country abroad. It says any estimate would be inaccurate. Tens of thousands of U.S. citizens, many of them dual nationals, are believed to live in Israel, Lebanon, Egypt, and Iran. Testy exchanges over immigration cases highlight growing confrontations between judges and DOJ. A federal judge clashed Tuesday with Minnesota's top federal prosecutor during an unusual contempt hearing that highlighted growing confrontations between increasingly frustrated judges and Department of Justice officials. U.S. District Judge Jeffrey Bryan called Tuesday's hearing to decide whether U.S. Attorney for the District of Minnesota, Daniel N. Rosen, and others should be held in contempt for not heeding orders to return the personal property of 28 of immigrants who had been detained and then ordered freed. The property ranges from cash to identity documents to clothing. Bryan, who had said in calling for the hearing that there had been numerous unlawful violations of court orders, started Tuesday by saying it would be a historic low point for the U.S. Attorney's Office if he held anyone in contempt. "Your Honor has made a remark smearing myself," Rosen shot back. The judge later called for a break in the hearing to allow for a reset, acknowledging the two had been a little testy and frosty with each other. There has been a surge in recent weeks of judges issuing critical and sometimes scathing statements and rulings over fallout from the administration's attempts at mass immigrant deportations, with the Department of Justice sometimes appearing unable to keep up with the flood of cases from the crackdown. Among other cases across the country, a district judge in Minnesota took the rare step last month of finding an administration lawyer in contempt for failing to return identification documents to an immigrant, and a judge in West Virginia chastised U.S. and state officials for jailing non-citizens indefinitely, saying it violates their constitutional right to due process. Continued detention without individualized custody determinations after this court's repeated holdings that such detention violates the Fifth Amendment will result in legal consequences, U.S. District Judge Joseph Goodwin said in his order. But the chief federal judge for Minnesota has repeatedly grabbed national attention with his warnings. Last week, Chief Judge Patrick Schultz said Rosen and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials must comply with court orders or risk criminal contempt charges. The court is not aware of another occasion in the history of the United States in which a federal court has had to threaten contempt again and again and again to force the United States government to comply with court orders, wrote Schultz, who was appointed to the bench by President George W. Bush and is seen as a conservative. The administration has blamed judges for the crisis, accusing them of failing to follow the law in rushing cases. Pakistan says its forces killed 67 Afghan troops in cross-border clashes. Kabul rejects the claim. Afghan forces attacked Pakistani military operations along the border early on Tuesday, triggering intense clashes that left 67 Afghan troops and one Pakistani soldier dead, officials in Islamabad said as cross-border fighting between the two countries entered its fifth day. The Taliban Defense Ministry in Kabul, the Afghan capital, rejected Pakistan's claim. A ministry spokesman said Afghan forces in the past 24 hours repelled Pakistani attacks, destroying about a dozen military posts and killing 4 Pakistani soldiers. The latest Afghan-Pakistan escalation erupted last week, with Afghanistan launching attacks on Thursday in retaliation for Pakistani airstrikes the previous weekend. Since then, Pakistan has carried out operations along the border and declared it was in an open war with Afghanistan, alarming the international community. On Tuesday, Pakistan said Afghan forces attacked Pakistan's military in 2 sections of the two countries' border. It said 16 locations were attacked along the southern port of the border in the southwestern districts of Kila Safula, Nushki, and Shaman in Pakistan's Balochistan province. Pakistani troops killed 27 members of the Afghan forces there and successfully repelled these multiple attacks, Information Minister Atullah Tarar said. Tarar said on X that another wave of attacks hit 25 locations along the northern part of the border in the northwestern Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where Pakistani troops killed 40 members of the Afghan security forces. The spokesman did not say where the Pakistani soldier was killed. In Kabul, Defense Ministry spokesman Inayatullah Khwarizmi slammed the Islamabad statements as baseless. The border area where militant groups, including Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State group, are also active, is not accessible to the media, and the Associated Press could not independently confirm any casualty reports. In past escalations and cross-border exchanges of fire, Pakistan and Afghanistan have both repeatedly claimed to inflicting heavy losses on the other side. In the 5 days of fighting, Tahrir said Pakistani forces have so far killed 464 Afghan security force members and injured 665. Khwarizmi said in a statement that so far 28 Afghan soldiers have died and 42 others have been wounded in the fighting. Islamabad has long accused Kabul of providing a safe haven to militants fighting the Pakistani government, charges that Afghanistan's Taliban government denies. Khwarizmi reiterated that stand on Tuesday. I repeat once again that we will not allow any person or group to use our territory against other countries, he said. Separately, Hamdullah Fitrat, the Afghan government's deputy spokesman, accused Pakistan of violating Afghan airspace and targeting homes, mosques, religious schools, or madrasas, and other civilian targets in Kabul, Laman, Nangarhar, Paktia, Kandahar, and Kunar provinces, as well as targeting refugee camps. He said these attacks have resulted in the death of 110 civilians, including 65 women and children. Fitrat said the Taliban government of Afghanistan considers its legitimate right to protect their people and will fight against the enemy until this aggression is stopped. Meanwhile, the UN mission in Kabul called for an immediate halt to the fighting, warning that the conflict is worsening Afghanistan's dire humanitarian situation. According to its preliminary figures since last Thursday, at least 42 civilians have been killed and 104 injured, including women and children. On Monday, Pakistani President Asif Ali Zardari defended the ongoing fighting with Afghanistan, saying Islamabad had tried all forms of diplomacy before targeting militants operating from Afghan territory. He asked Kabul to disarm groups responsible for attacks in Pakistan. Pakistan has experienced a surge in violence in recent months, which it blames on the outlawed Pakistani Taliban, known as Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or TTP. Islamabad says the TTP operates from Afghan territory and have the protection of Afghanistan's Taliban government. Kabul denies the accusations. The latest fighting has ended a ceasefire brokered by Qatar and Turkey in October. Talks in Istanbul failed to produce a permanent agreement, and Pakistan has said that operations will continue until Afghanistan takes verifiable steps to rein in the TTP and other militants. The Pakistani Taliban are a separate group but allied with the Afghan Taliban, and since the Taliban ceased power in Afghanistan in August 2021, the TTP has become emboldened and escalated its attacks in Pakistan. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Europe defends military bases and struggles to evacuate citizens as it is drawn into the war on Iran. The U.S.-Israeli war on Iran and Tehran's retaliatory strikes across the Middle East are quickly dragging Europe in, forcing the continent into defensive action to protect military bases and evacuate citizens caught up in the conflict. The Middle East is home to some of Europe's key trading partners and a number of strategic trading routes. Many Europeans live in cities such as Beirut, Dubai, or Jerusalem, while large communities from countries including Turkey, Egypt, and the Gulf states have settled across Europe, Europeans weren't consulted on this U.S.-Israeli operation, but are now dealing with the fallout. While refusing to directly join the war, Britain, France, and Germany have said they would work with the United States to help stop Iran's attacks. The UK will allow U.S. forces to use British bases to attack Iran's missiles and launch sites. But Europe itself is not immune. Cyprus, holder of the European Union's rotating presidency, had to insist that it was not involved in the conflict after a Shahed-type drone damaged a UK airbase on the island's southern coast over the weekend. The Shaheds were developed by Iran, but have already been used in Europe by Russia in its war on Ukraine. Wary of other attacks at home, some European countries are also beefing up security at train stations and airports. Still, almost no European leader has criticized the U.S.-Israeli attacks. Many are satisfied to see the downfall of an Iranian regime that has for years arrested European citizens and challenged Europe's economic interests. Spain has been a rare dissenting voice. One can be against a hateful regime, Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said Sunday, and at the same time be against a military intervention that is unjustifiable, dangerous, and outside of international law. At the same time, helping to foster stability in the volatile Middle East region is a European priority. Fears over a sustained hike in oil prices and the possibility of a new wave of unpredictable migration mean that the continent must remain involved. Priority to stranded citizens. Europe's major short-term priority is ensuring the safety of thousands of citizens caught up in the war as it spreads. Concerns about getting people out were raised during an emergency meeting of EU foreign ministers over the weekend. No joint evacuation effort was launched, but one could be needed imminently. Germany says that about 30,000 German tourists are stuck on cruise ships, in hotels, or at closed airports and cannot get back home because of the conflict. Most of them are in the Middle East, but some are further afield, stranded because their travel connections run through Abu Dhabi, Qatar, or Dubai. A military evacuation was not possible due to airspace closures. The Czech Republic, meanwhile, has sent 2 planes to Egypt and Jordan to bring home Czech nationals, dozens of whom have traveled by bus from Israel. Another 4 planes were to be sent to Oman to pick up more of the estimated 6,700 Czechs in the region. Europe's economic interests. Iran has been threatening ships in the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow mouth of the Persian Gulf through which a fifth of all oil traded passes, and ships have been attacked there. Calls have mounted for the EU to help protect merchant vessels. In response, France was sending 2 more warships to beef up Operation Espides, the bloc's naval mission in the region, but they would only deploy to the distant Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, gateways to the Suez Canal, which links the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, to join 3 other ships already in place. Operation Espides was set up 2 years ago to help defend maritime traffic against possible attacks by Houthi rebels based in Yemen. But while the Houthis have expressed support for Iran, they did not immediately announce any military action on its behalf. Discussion is underway on a review of the operation's mandate and a possible toughening of its rules of engagement, but no changes are expected soon. Regional stability. Maintaining stability in the wider Middle East is a key European concern. Iran's acts of retaliation in several countries have been widely condemned. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas is expected to convene a meeting with Gulf Cooperation Council countries at foreign minister level later this week, as the bloc continues to try to reassure Iran's neighbors and other vulnerable countries nearby. Iran's attacks of a number of countries in the Middle East are inexcusable. The events must not lead to further escalation that could threaten the region, Europe, and beyond, with unpredictable consequences, Kallas said after chairing Sunday's emergency talks. The EU intends to drive diplomatic efforts to help reduce tensions and still aims to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, despite its nuclear development deal falling apart after the Trump administration pulled the U.S. out. NATO weighs in. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said in an interview that the United States and Israel's war against Iran is crucial for security in Europe. He said that allies could support the effort even without direct involvement in military operations through logistics and access. Rutte, a former prime minister of the Netherlands, said he unreservedly approves of Trump's decision to attack Iran and kill its supreme leader, raising the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran. It would be a stranglehold on Israel. It could potentially mean Israel's defeat, Rutte told German public broadcaster ARD in its Brussels studio on Monday. When asked the possibility of NATO entering the war, Rutte said absolutely no one believed that NATO would be involved. This is Iran. This is the Gulf. This is outside NATO territory, he said. NATO troops deployed for 18 years to Afghanistan, and its 2011 air campaign helped topple Libya's late leader, Muammar Gaddafi. New leaders in Iran. Officials say the EU has no preferred candidate to take over in Tehran, and in any case, it's too early to tell who might be best to back as future leader. The foreign ministers primarily expressed solidarity with the Iranian people. They offered support to their fundamental aspirations for a future where their universal human rights and fundamental freedoms are fully respected. The Europeans insist that a genuine popular movement against the regime arose in recent months, but that it was shut down in an unprecedented wave of violence. Thousands were killed and tens of thousands detained. One thing is clear. The EU is unlikely to back any leadership pushed by Iran's Revolutionary Guard. IRGC was added the bloc's terror list last month, making it almost impossible for the Europeans to take them seriously as an interlocutor. Russia-Ukraine talks planned for Abu Dhabi this week may change venue, Zelensky says. U.S. brokered talks between Russia and Ukraine, expected later this week, may take place in Switzerland or Turkey if a planned meeting in Abu Dhabi is not possible due to the war in the Middle East, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Monday. He also noted that Western countries have given no indication so far that their delivery to Kiev of vital air defense missiles could be disrupted by commitments to Middle East defense. U.S.-led diplomatic efforts to end the war that began with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 are continuing, but the American and Israeli attacks on Iran and the response of Iran and Iranian-backed militias firing missiles at Israel and Arab states may divert international attention from the 4-year-old conflict in Europe. Due to hostilities as of today, we cannot confirm the talks will take place in Abu Dhabi, Zelensky told reporters in a WhatsApp chat. He said last week that the United Arab Emirates capital would be this week's venue. Previous Russia-Ukraine talks have been held in Abu Dhabi, Istanbul, and Geneva. They have not produced a breakthrough on key issues. Zelensky said there has been no immediate change in American and European supplies of air defense weapons, especially American-made Patriot systems, to Ukraine. However, he noted that the volume of deliveries could fall if the Middle East attacks continue. Russia's effort to knock out Ukraine's power grid over the winter failed, Zelensky said. though it caused much damage. Russian aerial attacks are now turning to other infrastructure, including the water supply, he added. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said Sunday that the United Kingdom would bring experts from Ukraine to help Persian Gulf countries shoot down Iranian drones. Ukraine has built expertise in drone operations during the war as Russia launches daily bombardments with Shahed drones developed in Iran. But Zelensky said he had not received any direct requests either from the United Kingdom or other countries about that possibility. Listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Inside Macron's new deterrence strategy, 8 European allies, 1 French nuclear button. France is moving to align its nuclear deterrence strategy more closely with European allies while keeping full control over any strike decision, an unprecedented coordination that French President Emmanuel Macron described as crucial to bolstering the continent's strategic autonomy. Experts say the plan reflects growing doubts across Europe about U.S. reliability when it comes to the continent's defense. France has been the only nuclear power in the European Union since Britain's exit from the bloc in 2020. Macron's move reflects that, in the case of a nuclear crisis, France would be the one offering some form of a nuclear security guarantee, said Florian Gallery, a nuclear deterrence expert at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Security Studies program. Speaking Monday from a top-secret submarine base in western France, Macron announced a new step of France's deterrence. His speech marked what could be the start of a major shift in policy that would allow, for the first time, temporary deployment of French nuclear-armed aircraft to allied countries. Macron said that Paris has started talks with 8 nations: Britain, Germany, Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, Sweden, and Denmark. Partners joining the initiative would see their territory gain a clearly affirmed link to our deterrence, Macron said. Europe would shoulder more of its own security. American allies have played a central role in Europe's defense since the end of World War II, protecting the continent through NATO's nuclear mission. However, Macron noted recent U.S. national security and defense strategies reflect a reshuffling of American priorities. Faced with heightened tensions with Russia, which has a vast nuclear arsenal and is developing new missiles, and as China expands its nuclear forces, our way of thinking must change, Macron said. Outlining the new strategy he called for deterrence, Macron insisted that France won't share any decision-making since, under its constitution, the president remains solely responsible for any decision on using nuclear weapons. Still, that stance underscores a fundamental contradiction, Gallery said. The strategic backing intended to integrate French nuclear deterrence into a collective European defense framework necessarily requires a degree of coordination and joint planning, he argued. One cannot, for example, carry out a nuclear strike without consulting a partner, he added. France's new approach offers the possibility for partners to participate in deterrence exercises, Macron also said. In case of crisis, French nuclear forces could be supported by some European conventional capabilities. That could involve early warning systems, Allies' satellites and radars detecting and tracking missiles, engaging air defense, and anti-drone protections and long-range deep strike capabilities, he said. Ultimately, the new doctrine would allow the temporary deployment of nuclear-armed aircraft to allied countries across Europe, Macron added. Strengthening France's nuclear arsenal. Macron also said that evolving defenses among France's competitors, the emergence of regional powers, possible coordination among adversaries, and proliferation risks had led him to conclude that France must increase its number of nuclear warheads for the first time since the 1990s and the end of the Cold War. France currently possesses an estimated 290 warheads. Eloy Fayet, a nuclear deterrence specialist at the French Institute of International Relations, a Paris-based think tank, cited a part of Macron's speech where the president said France's nuclear deterrent is designed to inflict on an adversary damage from which they would not recover. That means we must always be able to inflict that kind of damage, Fayet said, while deploring Macron's decision not to publicize the numbers of France's warheads. If Russia, for example, improved its defense systems, then France would need more nuclear warheads, Fayet said. Complementing NATO's missions, Macron made clear that any European coordination would come in addition to NATO's nuclear mission, in which France does not participate, and be compatible with the alliance's role in European security. Ian Lesser, a NATO expert and distinguished fellow at the German Marshall Fund, said Macron's move reflects the state of security in Europe following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as well as the growing uncertainty about the American security commitment to Europe. Europe now has to deal with a more aggressive Russia for some time to come, Lesser said. NATO's deterrence works through a strong American troop presence in Europe, with U.S. nuclear weapons stationed there, including in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The bulk of Europe's conventional deterrence is lodged in NATO, Strategic Command and Organization, Design, and Deployment, Lesser stressed. NATO is critical, he added, and France is really not looking to weaken that, so the point about it being complementary is important. Israel sends troops into southern Lebanon as Hezbollah says it is ready for open war. Israel sent troops into southern Lebanon on Tuesday and warned residents of more than 80 villages to evacuate, as the Iran-backed militant Hezbollah group said it was ready for an open war with Israel in the wake of the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. The development came after Hezbollah fired rockets and launched drones early Monday toward northern Israel. Israel retaliated with a wave of airstrikes that killed 40 people in Lebanon, including 7 children, as well as a Palestinian militant and a Hezbollah intelligence official in Beirut's southern suburbs. That death toll is a revised figure from an earlier one reported by the Health Ministry, which said Monday that 52 people died in the strikes. Lebanese Health Minister Rakan Nassereddin told reporters on Tuesday that 40 died. Lebanon also said 246 people were wounded and that tens of thousands were displaced. The UN Refugee Agency said Tuesday that 30,000 displaced people were staying in collective shelters in Lebanon, while many others slept in their cars on sides of the roads as they could not yet find safe shelter. Hezbollah says it has no option but to fight Israel. Hezbollah fired 2 salvos of rockets toward northern Israel, the militant group said, while Israeli airstrikes overnight damaged a building housing Hezbollah's television and radio stations. Beirut's southern suburbs also saw a series of strikes on Tuesday afternoon that came without warning. The Israeli military later said it targeted Hezbollah officials. The Israeli military's Arabic spokesman, Ivashi Adre, warned residents of more than 80 villages and towns in southern Lebanon to leave, adding that people should not return to these areas until further notice. A senior Hezbollah official said that after more than a year of abiding by a ceasefire, As Israel's strikes continued on Lebanon, the group's patience has ended, leaving it with no option but to fight Israel. The Zionist enemy wanted an open war, which it has not stopped since the ceasefire agreement, Mohammed Kamati said. So let it be an open war, added the Hezbollah official. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun told the ambassadors of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United States, France, and Egypt on Tuesday that Hezbollah has been firing rockets from areas north of the Litani River. That's outside an area south of the river and along the border with Israel, where Lebanese troops have earlier said they are in full control. More Israeli troops enter Lebanon. The Israeli military said Tuesday it sent additional troops into southern Lebanon and took new positions on several strategic points close to the border. Lebanon's state-run national news agency said the Lebanese army was evacuating some of its positions along the border. Atri, the Israeli spokesman, said on X that the troops' movements inside Lebanon are meant to bolster Israel's forward defense system and create an additional layer of security. Lebanon's state-run national news agency said the Lebanese army was evacuating some of its border positions. A Lebanese military official confirmed to the Associated Press that Israeli troops had moved into several areas in southern Lebanon on Tuesday, and that the Lebanese army was repositioning in the area. The official spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss military movements. The UN peacekeeping force in southern Lebanon, known as UNIFIL, later Tuesday said its peacekeepers saw Israeli troops making forays across the border and then returning to Israel. Israel's army said its troops are still operating in Lebanon, but it wasn't clear how many soldiers remained inside Lebanon. Hezbollah began firing into Israel a day after the October 7, 2023 Hamas-led attack on southern Israel triggered the war in Gaza. After months of low-level fighting, a full-scale war erupted in September 2024, and Israel later launched a ground invasion of Lebanon. Israeli forces withdrew from most of southern Lebanon after a U.S.-brokered ceasefire halted the fighting in November 2024, but continued to occupy 5 points on the Lebanese side of the border. Israel also continued with near-daily strikes, primarily in southern Lebanon, saying that Hezbollah has been trying to rebuild its positions there. Lebanon's health ministry also said Tuesday that 397 people had been killed in Israeli strikes in Lebanon after the ceasefire took effect, and before Hezbollah launched its latest attacks. Syrians flee across the border. Thousands of Syrians living in Lebanon crossed back into Syria, fleeing Israeli strikes over the past 2 days. UNHCR said the number of people crossing from Lebanon into Syria jumped on Monday to 10,629 from typically between 3,900 and 4,400 a day since the holy Islamic month of Ramadan began in February. The vast majority were Syrian, but a small number of Lebanese citizens also crossed. Azam Swiri, a Syrian farm laborer working in southern Lebanon, said he saw streets packed with cars and people as he fled the bombardment. It took us 10 or 12 hours just to make it 30 or 40 kilometers, he said, after crossing into Syria Tuesday, adding that after he left, he heard that the house next to the one where he lived was hit by an Israeli airstrike. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 3rd issue of the Toronto Star. Your reader has been Brian. Thank you for listening.